Many years ago, there was an exceptionally mean and ugly woman who lived alone in carefully guarded seclusion near the banks of the Yazoo River. Nobody knew anything about her, but they loathed her nonetheless. They hated her so much they didn't even give her a name. It was rumored that on stormy nights she would lure fishermen into her house, poison them with arsenic, and bury them on a densely wooded hill nearby. This was her hobby, but although many people suspected her of these evil diversions, no one was able to prove anything. Then, one late afternoon in the autumn of 1884, a boy named Joe Bob Duggett was passing by her house on a raft when he heard a terrible, ungodly moan from one of the rooms. He tied his raft to a cypress branch, ran to the house, and looked through a window. What he saw chilled his blood and bones. 2 dead men were stretched out on the floor of the parlor, and the old woman, wearing a black dress caked with filth and cockleburrs, had turned her face up to the ceiling and was singing some dreadful incantation, waving her arms in demented circles all the while. Joe Bob Duggett raced to his raft, floated into town, and told the sheriff and his men what he had seen. They got a horse and buggy and sped to the old woman's house. They smashed down the door, but were unable to find either the dead men, who have never been found to this day, or the demented old woman. They climbed the stairs to the attic, opened the door an inch or two, and caught sight of several dozen half-starved cats, all bunched together and gyrating in their wild insanity. 2 skeletons, which were never identified by the sheriff's office, dangled from a dusty rafter. Fish bones littered the floor, and the smell was unusually pungent. The sheriff, his deputies, and Joe Bob stood there transfixed, finally banging the door shut when 8 or 10 of the cats tried to get out. Then, from the backyard, they heard the sound of footsteps in the fallen pecan leaves, and from an upstairs window they saw the old woman sneaking away into the swamps, which abounded along the river. "Stop, in the name of the law!" the sheriff shouted, but the old woman, who, as Joe Bob Duggett would later tell his grandchildren, looked half ghost and half scarecrow, but all witch, took off into the swamps at a maniacal gallop. They followed in hot pursuit, and a few minutes later they came upon a sight that Joe Bob remembered so well he would describe it again for the 1000th time on his deathbed in the King's Daughters Hospital in 1942. The old woman had been trapped in a patch of quicksand, and they caught up with her just seconds before her ghastly, pock-marked head was about to go under. But she had time to shout these words at her pursuers: "I shall return. Everybody always hated me here. I will break out of my grave and burn down the whole town on the morning of May 25th, 1904. Then, as Joe Bob also described it later, with a gurgle and a retch, the woman sank from sight to her just deserts. With the aid of pitchforks and long cypress limbs, the authorities were able to retrieve her body. The next day, with the wind and rain sweeping down from the hills, they buried her in the center of the town cemetery, in a cluster of trees and bushes, and around her grave they put the heaviest chain they could find, some 30 strong and solid links. If she can break through that and burn down Yazoo, the sheriff said, more in fun than seriously, she deserves to burn it down. The years went by. The long Mississippi seasons came and went, and the town forgot the old woman. On the morning of May 25th, 1904, some 20 years later, Miss Pauline Wise was planning her wedding. As she entered her parlor to show her visitors some gifts, she discovered a small blaze. Suddenly a strong wind, unusual for that time of year, spread the fire to the adjoining house. From Main Street, the fire spread to all intersecting streets and soon reached the residential section. The roar of the ever-increasing flames, the confusion of terrorized thousands, the hoarse shouts of the firefighters, and the sound of crashing walls made a scene of awesome horror that remained a fixed picture in the memory of eyewitnesses as long as their lives lasted. Many fine homes were destroyed, and every bank, every physician's, lawyer's, and dentist's office, every hotel and boarding house, every meat market and bakery, the newspaper and printing office, every church, clubroom, and lodge room, every telephone, telegraph, and express office, the depot, the post office, every furniture store, every hardware store, all but one livery stable, all but one drugstore, every barber shop, every tailor shop, every undertaking establishment, and in fact, nearly every business necessity. The next day, after the murderous flames had consumed themselves, several elder citizens of the town made a journey to the grave in the middle of the cemetery. What they discovered would be passed along to my friends and to me many years later, and as boys we would go see it for ourselves, for no repairs were made, as a reminder to future generations. As if by some supernatural strength, the chain around the grave had been broken in two. The story you just heard was an excerpt from the book Good Old Boy by Mississippi author Willie Morris. Now, growing up in Mississippi myself, I and my classmates were required to read this book when I was in the 5th grade. And required is being kind of used loosely here. And it's a very good book. I enjoyed reading it. It has very interesting characters, and Willie Morris, he's a very poetic author. He has a way of conveying very complex notions and scenes in a way that's very easily digestible, and his books make for a very quick and easy read. Now, once we were done reading the book, my classmates and I, we would take a field trip to the Yazoo Historical Museum, which used to be Morris's old high school. We would sit on the grassy patch outside and eat moon pies and drink RC Cola, much like how Willie and his friends Bubba and Billy and Hingy would have done when they were kids, and we ruminated over the literature lesson that we were standing right in the middle of. We would also pay a visit to the witch's grave in the middle of Glenwood Cemetery, just a few yards from where Willie Morris himself is buried. Now, the witch's grave doesn't really have a headstone, per se. It's just this big marker that retells the story of the witch's curse. No one in Yazoo remembers the name of the person who's supposed to be buried here. It's kind of been lost to the ages. And that's what you and I are doing here today. I've come back to this little Delta town all these years later because I want to find the true story behind this urban legend. And maybe, in this investigation, we'll be able to answer a question that's been bugging the people of Yazoo City for over 100 years. Who is the Yazoo Witch? Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch. Now, we could begin by examining a bunch of different aspects of this mystery, but I think we should focus in on a pretty big focal point, which isn't the witch herself, but instead the fire of 1904. See, the town of Yazoo City really did burn to the ground on March 25th, 1904, just as the legend says. Now, the true cause of the fire is still up for debate, even to this very day. But what we do know is that it started at the home of the Wise family here on Mound Street. In the June 3rd, 1904 edition of the Yazoo City Herald, their very first printing, right after the fire, it is noted that Miss Pauline Wise was gathering her friends together for a bridal party, as she was getting married soon. She took her friend into a back room to show her all of the bridal gifts that she had received, and she found that the room was filled with smoke and all of her presents were set on fire. To quote the Yazoo City Herald directly, "In but a few minutes the entire house was a seething mass of flames, the strong wind from the southwest driving them with lightning-like rapidity to adjoining residences and to the rear of the large two-story double-front store building of Wise Bros, which fronted on Main Street, the wind being so strong that the flames were driven through the building, which was 120 feet long and 60 feet wide, across Main Street, which was 60 feet wide, with wood awnings along both sides of the street, and which furnished ready material for the fast devouring flames to feed upon. This is where the carnage truly begins. Driven by strong winds, the flames spread from building to building up Mound and Main Street. The local fire department responded almost immediately, but it wasn't long before the water pressure from the fire hydrants soon gave out. An emergency call was made to the Jackson and Greenwood fire departments, who arrived shortly thereafter to help finish dousing the flames. The fire would last from roughly 8:30 in the morning to 5 o'clock that afternoon. 324 buildings would be lost, with 200 of them being people's homes. To quote the Yazoo City Herald again, here almost the entire business of the city was swept away. And this is not all. When one realizes that after the Yazoo City fire of Wednesday, May 25th, not a solitary bank, post office, newspaper, job printing establishment, physician's, dentist's, or lawyer's office, not a white church, but two of the colored churches, not a lodge or club room, express, telegraph, telephone, or waterworks office, only one drugstore and livery stable, not a meat market or bakery, a boarding house, furniture house, or undertaking establishment, barber or tailor shop, and many other absolutely necessary establishments for conducting the daily business affairs of a city of 6,000 population was left, then it can be seen that Yazoo City is the most complete wipeout by fire known in history.
And yet, despite all of that destruction, there is not one single reported casualty as a result of the Yazoo fire of 1904. There's also no mentions of a witch. That's right, if you look at this first initial report, or really any other subsequent news reports on the fire of 1904, you are not going to find any mention of this alleged witch. She's also not mentioned in any news articles or historical documents from before the fire, either. So let's step back and actually examine the legend surrounding the witch. If you ever make it to Yazoo City and you start asking around, you're going to find out very quickly that not everyone here shares a consensus about the witch or who she was. Everyone's heard the story, true, but they don't really agree on the finer points of it. There are some people who think it's purely a ghost story, made up to entertain children around Halloween. There are some people who believe parts of the story are true, that there was a real woman ostracized by the city and labeled as a witch. And yet there are some people who wholeheartedly believe that a real, actual witch is buried in the local cemetery and that she rose from the dead to exact her revenge. And even among those believers, none of them are going to tell you the exact same story. It would seem that everyone in Yazoo has their own interpretation of the story. There are some people who say that the witch was a nasty old spinster. There are others who say that she did perform witchcraft, but she used her powers as a healer. I remember distinctly being told when I was a little kid that she would eat the fishermen that she caught along the riverfront, even though these details aren't necessarily in the original story, at least as it's told to us by Willie Morris. And Willie Morris isn't even the first person to tell the story of the Yazoo witch. According to his wife Joanne, Willie likely heard the story from the father of his childhood friend, Jack DeSalle, and that's probably where he heard the legend from. But the real kicker is that the legend of the witch isn't even the only story surrounding this grave. There are other tales and legends that try to explain why there are chain links wrapped around this site. They're called etiological myths, or myths that are used to explain why something happens, or why something looks a certain way, or just why a landmark is where it is. A good example would probably be lightning. Why does lightning fall from the sky during a thunderstorm? Well, it's because the god Zeus is hurling down lightning bolts at people. They're used to explain away natural phenomenon, or just things you don't have a good explanation for. According to a Mrs. Brannon Jones, a longtime Yazoo resident, there never was a witch buried in the witch's grave. In 1978, Mrs. Jones would report to the Yazoo City Herald that she had moved to the town as a child shortly after the fire. According to her, the chains were all still intact even in 1906. Still curious though, she would go around and ask the other school children why there were chains wrapped around this one particular grave. And the kids would all tell her, the woman who was buried there got into a fight with another woman over her, the first woman's, husband. They fought with axes and the wife was mortally wounded. As she was dying, she told her husband if he wanted her to stay in that grave, he'd better chain her in because she was coming out to kill the other woman. There's another story about an unnamed man who was buried here long ago who was so nasty and vile that the town opted to put chains around his grave to make sure that he never came back from the dead. But my favorite theory, and the one that I think has the most solid evidence backing it up, is presented by a woman named Vay McGraw, which is kind of interesting considering that Vay McGraw is the Yazoo witch. Vay McGraw was a local and historian of Yazoo City, and she used to play the witch during cemetery tours. The town had been hosting a Which Way to Yazoo event at the cemetery since the 1970s, and for many years Miss Vay would dress up in her classic black cloak and pointy hat and scare children with her chilling cackle. And in 1991, she would write a letter to the editor of the Yazoo Herald. She writes, I have read the recent stories and letters to the editor in the Herald about the witch logo. I feel that I should now tell what has been handed down to me through my family about the so-called witch's grave in Glenwood Cemetery. My ancestors buried a member of the Oddfellows, a secret fraternal society whose symbol bears a chain. I believe the records were burned in the 1904 fire when C.A. Collins & Co. was destroyed. This man was not a warlock either. There are probably other members of the Oddfellows buried on the same lot. I have always known that the witch was just a legend. In my mind, I treated it like a fairy tale. Now, Vay makes a very interesting point here in regards to the chain links. See, if you actually stop and look at them, they're not usual chains like you'd expect to see somewhere else. No, it's three very long, interconnected chain links on all four sides of the grave. You will see iconography a lot like this. Three interconnecting chains all throughout this one section of Glenwood Cemetery. It's printed on a lot of tombstones, like this one here, or here, or here, or here. Now this iconography, these three interconnecting chains, they're a symbol, typically used by the Independent Order of Oddfellows. The Oddfellows are what's called a fraternal organization. Think of it like a club, but the members come together to do things like charity functions or helping out around the community. The Oddfellows get their name because in the 1700s, when the group was originally formed, it was considered uncommon or odd to find groups dedicated to social unity and fellowship. Living in Mississippi, though, I've heard a much simpler explanation. These men were so nice, it was considered odd. But going back to the chain links, each link signifies friendship, love, and truth, core tenets of the Oddfellows teachings, and so they are typically printed on tombstones dedicated to their members. To really drive this point home, though, this immediate area around us is labeled on maps as the Oddfellows section of Glenwood Cemetery. In fact, there's a sign right over there pointing it out as such, just a few yards away from the sign that'll point you to the witch's grave. In October of 1899, the city of Yazoo would officially quarter off this area of the cemetery to be used only by members of the Oddfellows and their families. The area had been understood for a few years before then as a place where Oddfellows could be buried, possibly even as far back as the 1850s. It had also been a place used to bury white Protestants, Catholics, and strangers. After 1899, though, it would be used exclusively by the Oddfellows, but whatever graves were already there were not to be disturbed. But what I want to know is, who were they? If there ever was a headstone on this grave at any point, it is long since gone. Either it's been removed or it's sunk into the dirt. We can't really know. The original records would have burned to a crisp in the fire of 1904. I even went so far as to reach out to the sexton of Glenwood Cemetery and asked to look at the map of the Oddfellows section. And the portion of the map that would have had the witch's plot on it was missing. Just torn completely off the map, which is frustrating to say the least. But as it is, official records aren't going to be of any use to us here. The only real lead we have, again, comes from Miss Vay McGraw. In an interview she once gave, she recollects that at one time there had been a marker on top of this gravesite. It was very long and made of stone, and it had the initials TW written on top of it. And it looked sort of like this. Now, I'm no expert, but to me this kind of looks like a footstone. They're like headstones, except they're smaller and a lot less ornate. They usually don't contain names or dates, but just the initials of the person who's buried in a grave. Now, there's one other small detail that probably bears mentioning here. One of the core tenets of the Oddfellows was that they would bury the dead for families that couldn't afford a proper burial. Now, you could buy a plot specifically for this one person, or you could opt to have them buried in your family's plot. But it would have to be in the section of the cemetery that's already dedicated to the Oddfellows. And if this family couldn't afford a grave, they likely couldn't afford a full headstone either. Unfortunately, this is where the trail starts to run cold for us. As we've already discussed, the cemetery's records would have been destroyed in the Big Fire of 1904. Now, I was able to find that when an Oddfellows Lodge disbands in a town, its records are usually adopted by another Oddfellows Lodge as a way of safekeeping them. I tried calling around to the remaining Oddfellows Lodges in Mississippi, but I didn't really turn up anything. It would seem that if the Yazoo City Lodge did keep a record of who was buried in this plot, the record was either lost in the fire of 1904, or if it survived, it would be lost in another fire at another Oddfellows Lodge just a few years later. Man, these fires are a freaking menace. However, I think we can safely conclude that this grave either belonged to a member of the Oddfellows or was donated by a member to someone who couldn't afford a proper burial. Personally, I'm inclined to the latter. I think that this grave was donated to somebody in need, as the only semblance of a marker that we have was a simple footstone. And even then, we don't really know for certain that that marker existed. It really could have just been an unmarked grave. On top of this, while the chains around the grave likely are a symbol of the organization, they could also be grave markers in and of themselves, marking this gravesite all by itself just for one individual person. The Oddfellows were known to bury their members and their entire families, and it would be really uncommon for you to find a grave plot for just one person, unless that person was destitute, or they happened to be a stranger who died while passing through the town. It's really impossible for us to say for certain. But what I feel I can say for certain is that the legend of the Yazoo Witch is a perfect example of how folklore can develop over time. If a stranger dies and is buried in an unmarked plot, then over time, within a generation or two, no one is going to remember who they are. If a fraternal group disbands and leaves a city, within a generation or two, no one is going to remember what they are or what their symbols look like, or even that there's a whole section of the local cemetery dedicated to them. We have this cultural symbolism of chains being used to restrain things or people, and to see them wrapped around a gravesite would likely lead you to wonder, what are they trying to keep locked away down there? Is it the ghost of a vengeful wife, a nasty old man, a witch? The possibilities are endless. Without a doubt, Willie Morris would popularize the big famous story about the witch buried in this unmarked grave, but as we've seen, the cultural ecosystem surrounding this legend has added details over time that just weren't in the original story. If you go back and study the history of this legend, you get to see it develop into a bajillion different possibilities that a bajillion different people are going to believe for a bajillion different reasons. Also, I have met and talked to quite a few people who genuinely believe that the witch existed simply because, well, she did come back from the dead and burn the city to the ground, just as she said she would. And while there's no denying that the fire of 1904 did happen, they're kind of missing that crucial first half of the story. If you go back, you'll never find any evidence of the witch herself because, quite frankly, she just didn't exist. Underneath this marker and chains, there is not a hag or a monster, but a person. A man or a woman? We'll likely never know. Their name? We'll likely never know. But certainly, they are not, and never were, a witch. I gotta admit, this one is kind of a bitter defeat for me. See, I, the Witch of Yazoo City has a very special place in my heart. I've been listening to the legend ever since I was in elementary school, and I figured if I could be the one who finally solved the mystery of who's buried in the witch's grave, it would be a really nice notch on my belt. I'd be really proud of that one. Now look, I know in the past I've knocked other urban legends that don't have any historical records to back them up. I mean, look at my video on the Angel's Glow of Shiloh as a good example. But there's a distinction to be made here. These cemetery records I'm looking for likely did exist at one point. It's just they've been lost to time. Either they were burnt up in the fire of 1904, they were displaced after the fire. There's a billion different things that could have happened to them, but point is they're lost, gone, like ashes in the wind. I really thought that if I looked hard enough, if I looked under every stone, I would finally find something hidden in the stacks that everyone else had missed. That one smoking gun, but nothing. I've got all of these clues and they don't add up to anything. And now, unfortunately, it looks like this video is going to have to serve as the culmination of everything that can be found about the Yazoo Witch's identity. At least for now. See, this channel is about solving mysteries, not just telling people about them. Now, I am just one person. My knowledge only goes so far. But there are a lot of people on the internet who are a lot smarter than I am. So, it might be a long shot, but I'm going to put this out there. If you happen to see this video and you have an idea, a theory, something else that can be looked into that could lead to the discovery of the witch's identity, please let me know. Write a comment down below, shoot me a message on Instagram, or shoot me an email at mwalkerparainvestigator@gmail.com. I'll put all the links down in the description. And if you do send something my way that is able to help us find out the true identity of who's buried in this grave, I would really love to have you on the show so that we can talk about what you found. Now, I do want to put something out there as well. I get the idea that a lot of people, especially in Yazoo City, aren't going to be too happy about seeing that I made this video. I worry that they think that by dismantling the legend of the Yazoo Witch, people aren't going to want to come here anymore. In fact, I don't have to worry about that. A lot of people have told me that directly, so I want to at least say my piece about it. First off, there is still plenty of things to see and do in Yazoo City. For one, the food is amazing here. Tom's on Main Street will make a fried bologna sandwich that'll knock your socks off. I guarantee it. There's also the Hall of Fame, which is another restaurant that serves burgers and fries, and every single thing on their menu slaps. And there's also the Blue Front Cafe, which is a stop on the Mississippi Blues Trail. Now, those last two are technically in Bentonia, but they're practically Yazoo City. They're all roped in together in all the visitor centers information and pamphlets and stuff. But you can also go see the Yazoo Historical Society Museum, which has relics from the fire of 1904. It has ancient whale fossils and a collection dedicated to Willie Morris and other Mississippi authors. There's also the Ricks Memorial Public Library, which is where I did a lot of the research for this episode, but it's also the oldest public library in the state of Mississippi. I also recommend that you come and just take a tour of Glenwood Cemetery itself. There are plenty of other interesting people who are buried here, like the Wise family, whose home was the epicenter of the Yazoo fire. There's also another local mystery here, the graves of John and George Hancock, who claim to be the grandsons of the John Hancock, the man who signed the Constitution, which is a very bold claim, considering John Hancock signed the Declaration of Independence, and neither of his children were known to have children of their own. But as for the witch, you can know the true history of this grave and still come to see the witch. You can still come to enjoy the story. I'm not trying to take that away from anybody. I just think it's important that somebody, at least one person, has tried to put this information out there. People are going to be whispering the legend of the Yazoo Witch until the end of time. I'm not so bold as to think that my little YouTube channel is going to change that. But I'm concerned with the person underneath the tombstone, the real person who's buried here. I think from a historical perspective, it's important that we do everything we can to try and figure out who they are. And on a personal level, I think it's important that they be remembered for who they truly are. Not as a hag or a witch, but as a real person. And I think there are others who want to share that story too. Actually, one of the days I was out here shooting B-roll footage, there was this one couple. They came looking for the witch's grave, and they stumbled across me shooting my video, so they asked what I was doing, and I told them everything that I've told you. I told them about the chain links, the history of the grave, the odd fellows, and they found it very interesting, and they took their pictures. They thanked me for my time. They left, and the very next day I was out here shooting videos again, and when you know, they came back again, and they brought a friend with them to tell the true story of the Yazoo Witch. However, I think I'm gonna end on almost a counterpoint here. See, as important as I think it is to tell the true story of who's buried in this site, I cannot deny the allure that the legend has brought to this grave. I cannot tell you how many times I had to stop recording and move my camera to the side so that visitors could come and see the witch's grave for themselves. Everyone is fascinated with this legend, and for good reason. It's an interesting story. And I couldn't help but sit back and think that whoever this person is, they are receiving way more guests than anyone around them. All of the graves in this immediate area are for people who died in the 1800s. Anyone who would have remembered them is long since dead. And yet this one person, this poor stranger who couldn't even afford a tombstone, no one even remembers their name, they still receive guests 100 years after they die. It's ironic, really. I guess it just goes to show you that there's really nothing wrong with just a little bit of hocus pocus. God, that was so lame. Oh, let's pack it up. Hey guys, I just want to say thanks again so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for going on this wonderful journey with me. This video has been the culmination of months of hard work. A lot of research, writing, blood, sweat, tears, a lot of traveling and staying overnight in weird places. Just a whole lot of effort has gone into making this for you, and I really appreciate it that you made it this far into the video. If you really like the show, please, of course, do all the YouTube things. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, maybe leave a comment for us. Also, as I said in the video, if you have any information about the witch's grave, please feel free to leave it down in the comments, or you can reach out to me through the links that I'm going to be putting down in the description for the Instagram or my email. But to wrap things up, I just want to say again, thank you guys for watching. It's been a pleasure to go on this journey with you, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Get my hair flipped up. Gotta look all nice and pretty.